Welcome back to another episode of the Phantom Navigator, the only podcast on the audio spectrum that smells faintly of burning sulfur in corporate legal malpractice. I'm your host, and today we are talking about signatures, specifically ink that requires a pen made of human femur and a signature written in raw hemoglobin, because verbal agreements are for amateurs and ghosts who don't know their legal rights. Somewhere in Paris, sitting in a climate-controlled vault at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, there is a legal contract signed by Satan. Not supposedly, not allegedly. There's a physical document, ink on paper, 4 centuries old, bearing the notarized signature of Lucifer, Beelzebub, Leviathan, and 4 of their associates. It was entered into evidence in real court in front of real judges, and it worked. Here's the part that should actually keep you up tonight. Hell, apparently has paperwork department. Somewhere down there is a mid-level demon named Balberith, whose entire cosmic function is being Satan's court clerk, not tempting kings, not devouring souls, filing. But the contract isn't even the disturbing part of the story. The disturbing part is a 25-year-old woman who had a reoccurring dream about a man who rejected her and turned that rejection into an international tour. And the part that's worse than that is the man who volunteered to take her demons into his own body to save her and lost 20 years of his life for it. While she got a crowd, a queen, and a jeweled reliquary. This is the story of how one burned a town, executed an innocent priest, and left a trail of ruined people in its wake. Some of them famous for it, and some of them erased by it. I'm your Phantom Navigator. Let's start with the rejection. Before she was the most famous possessed woman in French history, Jeanne de Belsier was just a baroness's daughter with a childhood accident that left her permanently disabled and, by the era's brutal social math, unmarriageable. Sit with that, because it's the actual engine of everything that follows. In 17th century France, a noblewoman's entire value was measured in marriage prospects. Jean's family looked at her, decided she'd never get an offer, and did what families like hers did with daughters they couldn't place. They sent her to a convent. Not because she had a calling, because she had nowhere else to go. She became a prioress of the Ursuline convent in Loudun at a young age, probably because of her noble blood, not her piety. Contemporaries describe her as ambitious, mean, arrogant, and extravagant. Someone who fed a good performance of holiness while nursing something else entirely underneath. And then Father Urbain Grandier arrived in town. Handsome, wealthy, magnetic. The kind of priest who had women in Loudun quietly rearranging their schedules around his sermons. When the convent's confessor died, Jean saw an opportunity. She could bring Grandier in as the convent's new spiritual director. Close proximity, a respectable excuse to be near him. She wrote to him herself. Grandier said no. He had the good sense and absolutely catastrophic bad luck to decline. Weeks after Grandier's rejection, the nightmares started. Jean began having reoccurring dreams of Grandier appearing to her at night. In her own later account, she described the visitation not as haunting, but as something closer to seduction. A man showed up in her sleep demanding things a nun should never have to describe out loud. She wasn't alone. Other nuns reported similar visitations, one grieving the recent death of the old confessor, interpreting the figure as his lingering soul. But Jean's version was different. Hers had a name attached, and hers had an edge of fury underneath the fear. Within weeks, a devil was speaking through Jean during exorcism announced, under oath, that Grandier had gotten into the convent through a bouquet of musk roses left on a dormitory step, a deliberately erotic object smuggled into a house of chastity. A rejection, a dream, a bouquet. That's the entire forensic evidence base for what became a national witchcraft trial. And it didn't stay contained to one woman having one grudge. By the time the case peaked, 27 nuns had claimed to be possessed, obsessed, or bewitched. The convents became something closer to a stage than a chapel. Nuns beating their heads, bending backwards until their spines arched impossibly, walking on their hands, screaming blasphemies in voices that weren't their own. Witnesses described a huge black ball rolling through the refectory, knocking nuns off their feet. Whether it spread because the rituals themselves triggered it, or because an entire convent of overworked, cloistered women, average age 25, found themselves suddenly given permission to scream, shake, and say things out loud that had nowhere else to go. The fire caught fast either way. Jean's obsession would have stayed a personal tragedy if it hadn't found infrastructure. A local priest named Father Mignon, who had his own grudge against Grandier, heard about the fits and immediately recognized the shape of something useful. He'd seen this exact playbook before, 20 years earlier in Aix-en Provence. Another set of possessed Ursuline nuns had gotten another priest, Louis Gaufridi, burned alive for an alleged demonic pact. Mignon knew the ending before he even wrote the beginning. He reinforced the narrative daily, kept the fix going, fed Jean's private wound in a public case. Then the machine got bigger. Grandier had already made an enemy of Cardinal Richelieu, publicly opposing his order to tear down Loudun's fortifications, and suspected of writing a pamphlet mocking him directly. Richelieu didn't need to believe in demons. He just needed a demon-shaped excuse. He sent his commissioner, Jean de Laubardemont, who, worth noting, was also a relative of Jean's, to run a trial where Grandier's right to appeal was revoked before it even started. A local magistrate named Sarase actually believed this was fraud and illness, not witchcraft, and tried to shut the exorcisms down. He was overruled. A court order went further still, forbidding anyone in Luden from publicly debating or disagreeing with possessions. On pain of death, you could be executed in this town for saying you didn't believe in the haunting. So here's your cast by the time the trial starts. A woman whose private fixation kicked the door open, a priest with a professional grudge who saw the opportunity, a commissioner with family ties to the accuser, and the second most powerful man in France who needed a political scapegoat and didn't particularly care whether the scapegoat was guilty. Nobody in that chain needed to believe in hell. They just needed everyone else to, on pain of death if they didn't. That's when somebody handed the court a contract. The pact submitted as evidence is split into two parts: Grandier's covenant and the demon's formal reply. The demon's half is written in mirror Latin, meaning it's written backwards. You need an actual mirror held up to the page to read it comfortably. Because apparently even in hell's copywriters wanted you to feel something when you read the terms and conditions. It's signed by name, by Lucifer, by Satan, treated in this document as two separate entities with two separate signatures, which raises more questions than answers. Also signing Beelzebub, Leviathan, and two demons you've generally never heard of, Elamai and Astaroth, each with their own little sigil. Like a medieval group project where everyone had to put their initials on the poster. And at the bottom, doing the unglamorous administrative labor of eternal damnation, Balberith, self-described as the Secretary of Hell. Translated loosely, the terms, the demons promise Grandier the love of women, the flower of virgins, respect and power. In exchange, he agrees to go on a 3-day bender once a year, trample sacred objects underfoot, and offer up a yearly seal of blood. Live it up for 20 years, then join them in eternal damnation. 20 years! Hell runs on fixed-term contracts. There's a second document, too, allegedly in Grandier's own handwriting, personally signing away his soul. A signed legal confession from the Prince of Darkness, written partially backwards, submitted as evidence in a human court, and the court said, checks out, that's not supernatural proof. That's a hit job with a flair for the theatrical, wrapped around one woman's rejection like a legal shell company. On August 18th, 1634, the court decided confessions needed a little encouragement. Grandier was subjected to brodequins, the boots, wooden wedges driven into a frame around the legs, hammered in one at a time, slowly crushing the bone. He didn't break, didn't confess, refused to give them the words they wanted, even as they shattered his legs. He was sentenced to burn alive, with the promised mercy of strangulation first. But the crowd was agitated, chaotic, and his own exorcist, a priest named Father Lactance, either panicked or made a choice and lit the pyre before the executioner could tighten the rope. Grandier didn't get the mercy of Garrett. He burned alive in front of the entire town. And here's the detail that should really sit wrong with you. By the time he died, Jean and the other nuns had already withdrawn their accusations. They recanted. It didn't matter. The court proceeded anyway. The machine Richelieu built didn't need the accuser to still be accusing. It just needed the verdict. The demons were supposed to leave once Grandier was dead. They didn't. The improvement lasted a matter of weeks. Jean remained possessed, by her own later account, by 7 different demons for years after the man who supposedly sent them was already ash. 4 months after Grandier's execution, a new exorcist arrived in Loudun, a Jesuit named Jean-Joseph Surin. Here's a detail that should stop you cold. Surin and Grandier had actually gone to the same school as Bourdeix. Years before any of this, 2 boys from the same college, one would end up burned at the stake, the other would end up trying to absorb what was left of the wreckage. Surin arrived already fragile, headaches, muscle pain, chronic depression. A man who'd spent years starving and denying himself the name of holiness. He was, by every modern account, exactly the wrong person to hand a case like this. And he was given special personal charge of Jean d'Angers. He believed in her completely. Every symptom, every fit, every claim. Surin never doubted it for a second. And when the exorcisms weren't working fast enough, he did something no one asked him to do. He volunteered. Surin offered his own body as a vessel, asking essentially to take Jean's demons into himself so she could be free of them. And by his own account, and the accounts of everyone around him, his prayer was answered. It started in his body the same way it had started in hers. Headaches, breathing difficulties, trembling. Then it went further. Pain that started at the base of his stomach and spread. Fits, a conviction that he himself was now damned, personally, eternally, beyond any hope of forgiveness. This wasn't a performance. Unlike the nuns, Surin stayed fully self-aware through every bit of it, coherent enough to write detailed, articulate accounts of his own unraveling in real time, which somehow makes it worse. He wasn't lost in a fog. He was watching himself fall apart 1 page at a time. It lasted 20 years, 2 decades of what he described as demonic harassment, periods where he couldn't move without pain, couldn't write, couldn't breathe freely. He tried to take his own life more than once. He was, for years, functionally unable to work. He did eventually recover. Late in life, a slow and uneven climb back out, years before his death. History remembers him, when it remembers him at all, as either a genuine mystic who bore a kind of spiritual stigmata, or a deeply unwell man who mistook his own breakdown for holiness. He was never canonized. His name barely survives outside academic footnotes. He gave 20 years of his life trying to absorb someone else's demon, and the woman he did it for became a celebrity. While Surin quietly disintegrated. Jean's story went into the other direction entirely. In 1635, marks appeared on her forearm. The name Jesus, Mary, and Joseph raised into the skin like scar tissue, which she and her supporters called divine stigmata, proof that heaven had personally signed off on her ordeal. A cross reportedly appeared on her forehead and bled for 3 weeks. Starting in 1638, she went on tour, an actual pilgrimage circuit, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Montpellier, Avignon, Grenoble, Lyon, with nobility providing the coaches. Tens of thousands of people turned out in each city to see the marks on her arm and touched a shirt she claimed was stained with holy oil. After a vision saved her from death, she had an audience with Queen Anne. She sat at the bedside of the dying Cardinal Richelieu, the same man whose political machine had used her private obsession to burn a man alive. She probably faked the oil stain. Historians say as much. It didn't matter. It had already become a relic. Jean des Anges died in 1665, the same year as Surin, the man who broke himself trying to help her. Here's your ending, because it doesn't get more unresolved than this. Her head was removed from her body and sealed inside a silver and gold reliquary. Her stained shirt got its own reliquary too. The convent commissioned a massive painting of her exorcism, glowing with saints and cherubim, and hung in the chapel for over 80 years, until a bishop finally ordered it taken down, and the nuns hid it by painting over it with something else. A woman's rejection became a demon. The demon became a trial. The trial became a public execution. The execution became a 4-year touring show. The show consumed a man who tried to save her and gave him nothing back. And the final act was a severed head in a jeweled box, worshipped by people who never knew or never asked how any of it actually started. Here's what actually haunts this story. It's not the mirror Latin. It's not Balberith and his little secretarial duties in hell. It's that a woman's private, human, completely ordinary heartbreak got picked up by men with bigger agendas and turned it into a machine none of them fully controlled. Not even her. And it's that one person in this entire story who acted purely out of sacrifice, who tried to physically absorb someone else's suffering to save them, get 20 years of private hell and a footnote, while the woman he saved got a queen's audience and a gold reliquary. Urbain Grandier wasn't killed by demons. He was killed by a no that landed on the wrong desk, and Jean Joseph Surin wasn't saved by God. He was consumed by trying to fix something that was never his to fix. Somewhere in France, behind glass, in a chapel most people walk past without a second look, there's a silver box with a head in it, and a shirt with an oil stain nobody ever proved was real. Nobody built a reliquary for the man who actually paid the price. Now, we're going to look at other contracts, the weird ones, the corporate nightmares of the abyss. So let's start with New Hampshire's own colonial legend, General Jonathan Moulton. Oh, Jonathan, General Moulton, was a man who looked straight into the eyes of the king of hell, slid across a mahogany table, and thought, I can out-bureaucrat this little demon. According to local folklore, Moulton sold his soul to the devil in exchange for his boots being filled with gold coins every single month. A solid deal, right? A real wealth generator. Except Moulton, being a Yankee capitalist of the highest, most sociopathic order, decided to exploit the loophole. He cut the soles completely off his boots, hung them over a deep cellar hole in his house, and waited for the devil to start dumping currency. Day after day, the gold kept pouring down from the dark, filling the endless boots in the massive cellar below, until the devil realized he was basically funding a colonial real estate empire straight into bankruptcy. Satan, the master of deceit, the prince of darkness, the architect of human misery, got out-lawyered by a guy with a pair of scissors and a hole in his floorboards. Imagine being Lucifer sitting in a lake of fire, looking at your quarterly budget report and realizing you just went broke funding a guy named Jonathan's shoe fetish. That's not horror, folks. That's a tax audit from the underworld. And then, of course, you have Giuseppe Tartini, 17th century violin virtuoso. Now, Tartini didn't technically hand over a signed piece of vellum on a smoky basement. He was too lazy for proper paperwork, but he woke up one night and the devil was standing in the edge of his mattress, casually playing the violin. Tartini later wrote that the melody was so breathtakingly, sickeningly complex that he felt his breath leave in his body. He woke up, grabbed his pen, and wrote the Devil's Trill Sonata. And listen to me very carefully. If you listen to that piece of music, you can hear the exact moment Satan realized he didn't need a blood contract because he could just ruin a man's sanity through high-registered double stops and trills that make your teeth ache. Think about the logistics for this for 1 second. The devil is thousands of years old. He has ruled over the conceptual agony of mankind since the dawn of creation. And what is he doing? He's moonlighting, notarizing parchment for peasants with identity crisis and playing acoustic covers for Italian violinists in the middle of the night. It's pathetic. It's small business administration with brimstone. If you're going to sell your soul, at least get dental. At least get a matching leather jacket. Don't do it for a pocket full of British sovereigns or a moderately catchy violin solo that gives you carpal tunnel by age 40. If you think that's not it, oh, you sweet naive creature. You think Jonathan Moulton and his leaky boots and the Italian violin player are the only times humanity tried to sign away eternal damnation for a shiny object? My friend, the underworld has a filing cabinet the size of Rhode Island, and it is overflowing with sticky notes, blood-stained vellum, and desperate academic regrets. The devil doesn't just sign contracts, he treats earthly souls like a venture capitalist with a caffeine addiction and zero risk aversion. Let's talk about the heavy hitters. Let's talk about Johann Georg Faust, the absolute blueprint, the Michael Jordan of bad life choices. Faust was a 16th century German astrologer, alchemist, and general academic fraud who looked at the entirety of human knowledge, shrugged, and decided, you know what? I want 24 years of absolute, unrestricted hedonism, and I am willing to pay for it with my eternal consciousness. He drafts a contract in his own blood and delivered it to Mephistopheles because Satan apparently outsourced field operations to a middle management demon back then. For 2 decades, Faust lives the high life. He summons Helena Troy. He drinks liquid gold. He acts like an insufferable tenured professor with a god complex. And then the bill comes due. 24 years up, right to the dot. His colleagues in the university building next door hears a series of sounds best describing as a watermelon hitting a brick wall at terminal velocity, followed by a demonic cackling. In the morning, they find Faust's quarters decimated, his eyes torn out, and his body pinned to a wall like a dried insect. That's what you get for leasing your soul, kids. No depreciation value, no trade-in options, just immediate structural failure of your physical form. And if you think Faust was just a literal myth written by Goethe to scare high school sophomores, let me introduce you to Christoffel Heisman, 17th century painter from Bavaria. Now, Heisman was having a rough time. Depression, financial ruin, creative block, standard artistic struggles. So what does he do? He signs 2 separate contracts with the devil. Exactly 9 days apart, written in black and red. The terms: he sells his body and soul to Lucifer in exchange for 9 years of wealth. Except, unlike modern corporate contracts where you need a team of lawyers to find the exit clause, Heisman actually managed to back out. He suffered a series of violent demonic hallucinations in a church of Mariazel, confessed to the priest, and the church launched a full-scale spiritual intervention. They forced the devil through a prayer and exorcism to hand the original blood contracts back. Imagine being Satan, walking into a celestial boardroom, having to explain to your superiors that you lost a legally binding, blood-sealed human assets because of a bunch of Austrian monks threw holy water at a printer. It's humiliating. It's an HR nightmare. So no, it's not just Molten and Tartini. History is practically paved with idiots trading eternity for a magic trick, a decent solo, or 24 years of tenure. Check your desk drawers. Stop signing things in red. And if for the love of everything holy, read the terms and contracts before you click accept. You wanted more? Well, let's dig deeper into the crusty, mildewed archive of diabolical human contracts. Fine, let's talk about Father Louis Goffridi again, because nothing screams holy man of God quite like getting yourself burned alive in 1611 for signing a literal blood pact with Lucifer and running a demonic franchise out of a French convent. Gaufridi was a 17th century parish in Marseille who apparently looked at his vows of celibacy and holy poverty, laughed out loud, and decided to outsource his ministry straight to Beelzebub. According to court records, which were extracted under the kind of creative torture that makes Spanish Inquisition look like a wellness retreat, Gaufridi signed a parchment in his own blood, explicitly renouncing God, the Virgin Mary, and every saint in the heavenly directory. What did he get for this celestial treason? Did he get untold wealth, immortality, a cool medieval sports car? No. He got the power to make young Ursuline nuns violently possessed simply by kissing them or breathing on them. Let that sink in. The grand architect of cosmic rebellion, the Prince of Darkness, entered a binding legal contract just so a French provincial priest could go around a convent playing a toxic game of tag with holy women. The nuns were convulsing, bloating, screaming obscenities in Latin, and tearing their hair out because of Father Louis didn't know how to behave himself. When they finally dragged him to the stake in Aix-en province, they strangled him first and then reduced him to cinders, leaving behind a legal precedent so bulletproof that it paved the way for every other mass hysteria trial in Europe. Good job, Louis. You really maximized your shareholder value. And speaking of institutional fraud, let's move across the border to Spain and talk about Magdalena de la Cruz. If Luis Gaufridi was a sloppy amateur, Magdalena was a corporate titan of deception. She was a Franciscan nun in Cordoba who managed to pull off the longest-running, high-grossing scam in ecclesiastical history. For 40 years, she was revered as a living saint. We aren't talking about minor parlor tricks here. Magdalena was levitating. She was glowing. She was bleeding from the palms with authentic-looking stigmata. She was predicting the future, fasting to the point where she allegedly didn't eat a single crumb for decades, and dispensing holy advice to nobles, bishops, and kings. In fact, when the future King Philip II was born in 1527, they actually wrapped the infant prince in Magdalena's monastic habit to protect him from evil. The baby royal was swaddled in clothing of a woman whose entire spiritual empire was built on a dark corporate merger with an incubus. Because at the age of 12, according to her later tearful confessions, Magdalena had signed a pact with the devil to secure 4 decades of global prestige. She didn't even have to try hard. The demons handled the special effects department while she sat back and enjoyed the VIP treatment. The gravy train finally derailed in 1543 when she fell dangerously ill and panicked, realizing that dying with a fraudulent soul was a bad career move. She called in the Inquisition, confessed to the whole thing, admitting stigmata were fake, the levitations was demonic outsourcing, and her holiness was an illusion. The Inquisition, remarkably merciful for once, didn't burn her at the stake. It just sentenced her to permanent solitary confinement in a convent cell to think about what she'd done. 40 years at the top of religious food chain, all brought down because she forgot to read the expiration date on the demonic contract. Never trust a nun who doesn't eat, and never sign a contract that lasts longer than a standard mortgage. Sleep tight, sinners.